everyone. Thank you for this great invitation and honor to speak here. It's, yes, my name is Genia Kostka, and I'm always interested in transitions. So I started my career working on environment. So I was interested in China's green transition. And later I realized, oh, there's something else happening here. China is really moving towards also a digital transition. So I call it the twin transitions, green transition and digital transition. And I'm always interested to see how this affects society and governance processes. But this is also a conference on inequality. So I will try from time to time to really link my topic to the topics we also discussed yesterday, because I always think all of these things have big impact on society. So let's start. So when we look, we can really see many changes in China. Anyone who has gone to China knows almost everyone now pays with their cell phone. There's over 1,000 million netizens. So China has one of the highest internet penetration rates. So almost everyone is connected and is using digital technologies. So it's almost a natural laboratory of, we can look and study what's happening in China. And some things that I discussed today will also actually be maybe familiar to your own life. And sometimes I think it starts questions that are also relevant on how we want to live and govern our society. So when you look at digital technology, so it's e-payments, which is everywhere in China, but also China had the health code, and I will talk about it today. It was the first country in the COVID pandemic to introduce this contact tracing app. In Germany, we had the Corona One app. What was it in Austria? Which app did you have? Oh, Stop Corona, oh, very activist app. But China, what's different is the health code app in China was mandatory, right? The Corona One app, and I'm sure the Stop Corona app was voluntary. So there are things a bit different, and we will look at this. Then there's also this infamous social credit system, and I will explain what it is and what it's not, because there are a lot of misunderstandings. And then there's also technologies like facial recognition. Everyone, or like almost everyone, uses this technology a lot more in China for e-banking. People also use it to get their pension paid out. So I think China is a little bit ahead of the curve. Whether you like it or not, we will see, and we can discuss at the end of this presentation. So now let's move to the topic. So I thought I didn't want to present you with detailed research findings. Instead, I will give 4 reasons what I think these technologies brought in terms of positive things. And then I will present 4 reasons why these technologies present negative things. And then we can discuss. So 4 things why these technologies are good in China. First, they help to really narrow socioeconomic gaps and improve transparency. It's also a new channel for citizens' participations, and I will give examples. It helped to really, in some areas, for poverty alleviation, and it also empowered certain populations. Like an example I will give are females in China from rural areas. So let's move to the first point. There's new channels for citizen participations. So China is, of course, a very controlled society. You have censorship, but you've seen really a lot of social media platforms popping up, like what they call Weibo, WeChat, or Douyin. And here you do have actually lots of discussions happening now. And yes, there's censorship, but there's also certain room for discussing also critical things. And the net citizens are very creative to find new ways of expressing themselves so they don't get censored immediately. So all these technologies actually increased information access. And so it's no longer that just, when I started my work, for example, I always had to go to talk to local government officials. That were the people who knew what's going on. But because of the technologies, I think information spreads more quickly, and information is also not all, but a lot more information is available. And they also use these ICT technologies for online consultations and open government processes. So every local government, for example, has a Weibo account. So if you want to know in your locality how's the air pollution, the local Environmental Protection Bureau has an account and reports this. I'm from Berlin in Germany, and I, out of fun, contacted my local government and just say, what's the PM 2.5 value in my neighborhood? Because there was a fire. And they were like, we are not collecting this, sorry. Yeah, so, I mean, I'm impressed, right? Like in China, in your locality, you can get the data. But me as a person from Berlin, that's not what is data that's not available for citizens. So now if we move for another example. So this is, for example, an app. It's called the Black Smelly Water app. And as the name already says, it has to do with something with smelly water. And it was introduced by the Ministry of Ecology and Environment and Housing and Rural Affairs. And they actually gave local governments clean water targets, right? China, very polluted. They're like, clean up certain waters. But at the same time, they also created this app where citizens can take photos in their neighborhood and upload it on the app. And then the government, the local government, has to respond to this. And what happened? You can imagine, did they get lots of reports? Oh, yes. So suddenly people report like wrongdoers. And so you can really see local governments had a lot of pressure. And at the beginning, they couldn't even follow up so many demands. And some local officials also complained because they were overloaded with these citizens' complaints. But it's a good process to put more pressure, especially on a big country like China, that citizens report or monitor local governments who maybe not always prioritize environmental cleanness as they should. So that's one example. If we move to the next, here it's just during the pandemic, especially China, was a really hard lockdown. And what was helpful is that already long before, every local government had digital initiatives. So we tracked actually, and in the last 5 years, there are more than 3,000 local initiatives that are related to digitalization. And again, me as a Berliner, I wish Berlin had a very functional digital website, because here you see every province now offers digital services. What is interesting is how did they within 2 years manage this kind of implementation? And there's a little bit very Chinese way about it. It's like forced, I call it always forced digitalization. So if you go to the next slides, you can see an example. There's one province, a coastal province, Zhejiang. They have, for example, this is a typical app, and anything you can need, you can do with that app. And but how did they implement this? They basically gave targets for each local government. And even normal officers in hospitals or staff from housing, which is not related to this app, were forced to ensure that they recruited people to download the app. So it's basically a very top-down approach. And people who worked in these offices were like, I'm a nurse, why do I need to force patients to download this app? But basically, this is a very much, if there's a goal that we have to achieve 50 million downloads of the app, then everyone who works in the government needs to share and make sure the goal is achieved. So I call it always a bit forced digitalization. And yeah, but the app is very useful for many citizens. When you ask them, people are very happy that they don't have to go to local offices anymore, but they can get this online. Now, one more example is, again, about transparency. Here you can see another, it's related to pollution. This is a bit what I mentioned. you can always put your position in and see how air pollution looks like. Again, this is very much citizens allowing them to monitor the air quality. Okay, so that was a little bit about citizen participation, how citizens use apps to also put pressure on governments. Now moving to the third positive thing that I mentioned is that it's also helping to close socioeconomic gaps. And what do I mean? I think digital technologies have been really used also for online education. So that's really has very achieved, many rural areas could overcome certain barriers here. We also see that rural areas started to outcut basically, they basically got better information and could use basically create online marketplaces and cut out the middlemen. So again, all of this helped, especially rural areas. We also see that some regions actually thought, oh, this is an opportunity for us to grow. So they set up big data training centers and really try to get in there. So the typical example here is on the next page, Guizhou. It's in the middle of nowhere. It's this little red dot there. So it's a very rural, very poor province. And here provincial leaders were like, okay, something's happening and we want to be a big data center. And initially, I mean, there's no big companies in this poor province, but actually they managed to convince companies to come in. They say we have cheap labor and we have electricity from hydropower stations. And then the local government gave a lot of financial incentives. And so now big companies like Apple, Alibaba, Tencent are building or these kind of data processing centers there. So some people say these digital towns also offer new growth opportunity. And final point of a good example is female empowerment. So a lot of migrant workers use these smartphones and they help to connect them. They get, again, more information on wages and working conditions. And all of this helps them. And so if you go on the next page, you can see that basically it created for a certain population new income. There's a huge market now, what's called live streaming e-commerce, and like 500 million are actually using it. So and this really helped to lower the threshold. So no matter which gender, what educational level, geography or financial background, everyone could basically start to sell something. And if you actually look and check, you will be surprised. It's often very young females who basically really use their family courtyard and start some businesses. And so that created really extra sources of income. Okay, so this was a little bit of a summary of how things have changed, how technologies are used. But of course, there is also some critical discussion needed here, right? This happened very fast. And how has this really affected society? So now when we look at the next, we will look a little bit at the risks and challenges. So one is to really actually look, has it really closed socioeconomic the gap? And we will look at this. Then we will look at what type of groups are actually excluded in this process. Then looking at these technologies come, of course, with biases and discrimination. And then finally, big topic, right? Do these technologies lead to control and surveillance? And to what extent is that happening? Okay, then let's start with the first. We just talked about female empowerment, that all these rural women start to do some e-commerce. And yes, of course, this is true. And it allows them publicity. But if you look closer, actually, the studies also show that these young entrepreneurs, actually, when they registered their companies, it's still actually often registered under their husband's names. So it's still basically old traditional values still dominate. We also have, so in a way, some people, we talked yesterday about rentier capitalism. Some people would say it's another form of digital capitalist exploitation of women's cheap and flexible labor. And it's not necessarily this live stream business world changing for these women. Same when we look at, we said that some provinces benefit from it, rural provinces like Guizhou. But if you look also closer, you actually see, these dots there. And the dots that are really in the top right are all rich provincial provinces. So what it means is their share of the digital economy is much higher as a percentage of GDP. So most of these digital economies are still in coastal rich areas, and the more like rural agricultural provinces actually have a much smaller digital economy sector. And same if you look actually where the big technology companies are based, like Alibaba, Tencent, they're all based in big coastal cities. So I'm not sure that this really helps hugely to avoid this problem that you actually have two Chinas. So you have a very poor China that looks like a developing country, that is Western Central China. And then you have also much more advanced, economically advanced coastal regions. And so I'm not sure that this is really closing these gaps. Okay, then now let's look at who's excluded in these technologies. So there are a lot of now surveys looking, and you almost have to have a smartphone in China to even pay for anything. So when you look at the people who actually are not netizens, also who are not using the internet, they report a lot of inconveniences in life. So they really cannot access public spaces without, for example, in the pandemic, right, the health code that I mentioned, the contact tracing app, it is mandatory. So without the app, you just could not access anything. Then there's also reduced offline as a services. I mentioned these government platforms, which is online. Some actually have a offline version, so you could still go to the government bureau, but some local governments actually just have the online version. And so that also makes it very hard for those who are not connected. You can not buy tickets or get registered to the hospital. 24% in that survey complained about that. So why do people are not internet connected? 61% of that group actually said they don't know how to use it. Then 28% says they can't use basic pinyin, also not the characters, but the English version of it. And then some say they're too young, too old. And some also 11% or 16% say they don't have the necessary device. So there are a lot of reasons, in rural areas also where people are not connected. So, I mean, China has 1.4 billion people. If 1 billion use the internet, it's still 400 million, who are in this group, who have somehow maybe some of these barriers. Okay, so if we go on the next slide, we actually were interested in the pandemic. So how do people discuss this? So we did like web scraping, where you collect a lot of messages, what people on social media discuss. And we've found that the main reason that people find very irritating, and these are not the people, not the 400 million. Now I'm going back to the group of the 1 billion people, those who you can use the internet. And of those, actually 40% really were very unhappy about the health code because it's mandatory. And if there are 3 colors: green, you can go to public spaces; yellow, you should stay at home; and red, you are really restricted. And sometimes, especially at the beginning, the health code was made many mistakes. So suddenly you had a red color and you didn't know why, and you couldn't leave basically the house. But that got better during the pandemic. And I think now these initial errors often have been avoided and so on. There are also, and I think I'm marking this yellow, it's 22% actually complained what I call the elderly populations encountering problems. And so sometimes on Weibo, it was maybe the kids who complained that their parents had issues with technology, or it was elderly who themselves complained about it. So we actually then did a study and we just finished it. We just talked to 55 elderlies across China to learn a little bit more about how elderlies perceive this big digital transition. And surprisingly, of course, their opinions are very diverse. It's not that you can say they all like it or they don't like it. We've heard really all sorts of opinions. But if we go, what we did learn is one thing: the pandemic definitely increased the gap. We call it the gray digital divide. So the gap for elderlies to belong to society, because during COVID, digitalization really advanced. The health code, digital services, for elderlies, they really had to learn how to use them. Otherwise, they really could not leave the house. And so I think that created a little anxiety and fear among many of them. And some of the fear, it's not what you sometimes think. It's simply what happens if my cell phone switches off. What happens is, but given that China is increasingly aging, it's really a big topic that I think is a little bit understudied. So if we go to the next slide, we actually then try to, those who were not very happy about it or had some worries, we asked them what the main barriers are. And the main barrier are still physical barriers for the elderlies. I think almost everyone complained about the eyesight or poor memories and inflexible fingers. And that was 94% of our very small sample. We 52 interviews, but they were in-depth interviews. But almost everyone had a physical barrier. And I think that's something to, we use our shiny screens. We never think how it's perceived among others in the population. Also, 88% mentioned some lack of digital skills. So when you had to register for the QR code in China, it's actually, you have to use your real ID, your real things. It's not just the Stop Corona app where you just anonymous and download it. It's a bit more, requires a bit more digital skills. And it was interesting. Those who had children didn't complain because they just asked their children for help. But those where the children were not there, they suddenly had to, use these QR codes. And so it made it clear that digital skills in that group of society is definitely not very highly developed. And so the anxiety and fear was especially high among those who don't have a strong social net. Yeah. Some also complained of complicated functions. Like in China, there are a lot more apps than in Europe. So and many are very complicated in some ways, and you have to pay bills via apps. So all of this creates pressure. And then we had some who just said it's too time consuming and energy consuming. It's actually surprising how busy elderlies can be. And they really felt this is not worth their time. And finally, there was what we called lack of motivation. Some people perceived it as useless. They see that technologies like that have no value for their lives. And some had really simply fear of learning new things. So technophobia and anxiety. But I just want to say, conclude on that gray divide with the topic. And what I find interesting is actually that the government has really responded to this. So what you actually can see here is one complicated app, but there are a lot of apps now who offer elderly versions. And the government actually really is pushing this to really tailor and adapt to the elderly needs. And there are also now some coping strategies that basically, that there's exceptions now again to pay in cash and so on. They also increased the training. So there's a lot of trainings for elderly. But interestingly enough, when we asked those who went to the training, they thought it was quite useless, but they went there because you got free eggs. And so we were not sure that this training per se, because it's in a big room, 50 people, and you train elderlies how to use these apps. I think what seemed to be more effective was asking, like those who had a social net, they were able to advance their digital skills. But the trainings per se, they look good and the government feels good that they're doing something. But yeah, the learning effect didn't seem huge from what we heard. But at least there are some new adjustments in the technology to also account for this. And there are many actually elderly app versions. And I don't think we have that, at least in Germany. I haven't seen really one app who has an alternative version for the elderly. Okay, so now I'm almost getting closer to biases, discrimination, and surveillance and social credit. That's what most people really get fascinated by. So, of course, China is using facial recognition. They've used it for schools. There are programs, for example, where in schoolrooms, facial recognition is used to check when children fall asleep, so how much attention they pay. And people feel quite okay about this. But facial recognition is, of course, a very it's very debated. I mean, in the US, many cities forbid it. In Europe, it's also not allowed, and if just, I mean, or at least in Germany, except some pilots. And it's because the technology is still a little bit biased. For example, white faces are much more easily recognized than colored faces. So for example, in China, if you're from an ethnic minority, you're more likely picked out by the technology than if you're Han Chinese. Yeah, so that's, I think that requires some debates. I mean, the technology got much better, but still, let's say I mentioned just now these elderly apps. One thing the elderly apps do is, because elderly, if they can't see, they can use the apps by voice recognition, right? That's a great adaptation. But the voice recognition is also, for example, in Mandarin. So if you are a non-Mandarin speaker, and there are 55 minorities in China, who maybe are not so Mandarin speakers, so they might not be able to use these elderly apps versions. So yeah, so there are all these biases and discriminations that maybe are a little bit hidden in the technologies. And then the final point is, of course, control and basically privacy intrusion. So when we look at China, it has CCTV cameras everywhere. Who has been in the last 5 years in the audience in China? Maybe can I see a hand? One? Okay, so you don't know maybe, but if you enter China, the airport, there are cameras everywhere. Yeah, and I think there are even artists in Beijing who made this their project to walk around Beijing to find streets that are not on camera. And that is not so easy anymore. Yeah, and that is an art project because they feel you're always surveilled. And it's often, I mean, this picture you can see, it's not just one camera hanging. There are always a couple of cameras and you're like, what are they all for and what do they do? And, but I think you feel definitely being watched. So China is the country with the highest number of CCTV cameras. Yes, I mean, if you look per capita, the US is also very high. If you go on the next slide, you can see Many of the cameras deploy facial recognition technology in China. But again, this facial recognition technology is not just used for control. I mean, the police bureau says they use it for example, finding missing children. There's a lot of propaganda about it, and people will tell you that this is very helpful. It creates security and finds missing children. Even though studies actually show that facial recognition cameras don't, or they say it prevents crime, even though there's no academic proof that facial recognition cameras are a good way of crime prevention. Also, these cameras are used a lot in ethnic minorities like Xinjiang, where really certain ethnic groups are suppressed. So there's definitely like some elements where certain groups in society have no choice but being tracked. Okay, but another way where I find there's also abuse or is when we go on the next slide. I just want to mention this example because I thought it's a very interesting example. So I mentioned the health code, right? Everyone has it, it's mandatory. And there were some protesters actually in one province. They were protesting about something completely else, about finances. And suddenly they wanted to organize another protest, and all their health codes were put on red, yeah, by the local government. So they couldn't leave the house anymore. And that's, I think, what I call maybe function creep. Yeah, I mean, the health code is to prevent the pandemic and not helping the local government to stop protesters. And this, interesting enough, I mean, Beijing also didn't like that the local government did this, so they got a talking to. But this is a little bit interesting, right? When and how functions of technologies gets abused. This time it was the local government who did bad, not the central government. But now actually the health code is deleted. They no longer use it. So I think that's also part of the response learning that these technologies can easily result in problems. Okay, now I want to finish with the infamous social credit system. So just one question, who believes that there is a social credit system in China? Maybe hands up. 1, 2, nationals. Yeah, okay, lots of hands, okay. So let's talk about what it is and what it's not. So there is actually not one social credit system in China. There's a lot of misreporting. So what there is there's a private scoring system. It's called Genia credit or Sesame credit. It's basically everyone who uses, e-payments by Ant Financials can on their cell phone check how much did I buy, and they get a score. Yeah, if you have a 700 score, you're a very loyal customer. You bought a lot. I mean, they have 5 different criteria, and I mean, what is different that Ant Financials uses all the different data from Alibaba. So they have a lot of information on you. But that is more like a private loyalty scheme. Yeah, so this is not what people usually talk about. So what I'm more interested in is the government scheme. So there's another scheme which is called the government-run local social credit system, but there is none of it. So what happened is in 2014, the government announced that they're interested in it. And what they did is actually announce different pilots. So there are different cities who experiment with it. And I will come to that in a second. There's also the myth that it's really technology based, but there's nothing related to technology at the social credit system. Actually, the most advanced system, it's in one city in Rongcheng. There actually you have credit officers. They go around on paper and ask people what they did and put it in very traditional Excel tables and merge that tables once a year. No, and it was actually really surprising, like the BBC, reported there was a wave where all very good newspaper TV programs reported about the score, and China has a score, and everyone who worked on it, we were all fascinated. What score are they talking about? And I think they confused it with the private score, which is a loyalty company scheme, but it's not the government. There are one or two, like a few pilots who have maybe, I mean, one pilot, it's a very small city, they have a score. And another city has letters A, B, C, D. But these are small cities, and most of these pilots are anyway not targeting citizens, but they actually, 70% of the pilots target businesses. And I come to this in a second. So in a way, there's no centralized Beijing database that has, that's called the social credit system or the social credit database. But let's look a little bit into this to learn a bit. So I told you now what it's not. So let's look into it, what it is. And what is it? So there are these 62 pilots, and that's typical for China, right? China's entire reform and opening up was done via experimentation. So you first experiment, you look, China's very huge, very different. So you do some experiments, look how it works, and then you decide whether you want to do a national rollout. So now all these 62 pilots look very different. So some, very few look at citizens, and some look at businesses. So make sure businesses implement food regulation or they follow the environmental regulation. Most of them are voluntary, but some, especially the ones for businesses, are mandatory. But the problem, of course, is if you have so many different pilots, how do you scale this up? And I'm not sure actually Beijing wants to scale it up. Even when you travel from one city to the other, this is very hard to make a conversion from one system to the other. And then actually, if you look closer at the models, a lot of local governments don't do any advertisement for this. So citizens don't know about it, and even businesses are really not so much aware. So for example, when we interviewed 44 citizens, well, I think last year and this year, only 33 didn't know about the social credit. Yeah, so if you ask a foreigner, do you know about the social credit system in China? Everyone's like, yeah, I know about it. So it's a very interesting thing that abroad, it's very popular, but in China, it's not. And I think one of the reasons is what it actually is. It's that local government bureaus share more data. So out of the 62 pilots, most is actually targeting businesses. And what's happening, there's some red lists and some black lists, and some businesses, for example, don't pay taxes and they pollute the environment. And before, the local government didn't know all the things they did because each bureau didn't share their data. And so what the local social credit pilots are now doing is to share data across government bureaus. So it's actually a very unsexy topic. It's basically intergovernment sharing database. It's actually useful, right? In Germany, you couldn't do it because there's some historical reasons again for data privacy. You would feel that if one government has this database, that's far too much information. But in China, I think there seems to be less worries because there is just one party, and if you ask people, they anyway feel the party has any information about them anyway. There's some resignation. Yeah, so this is just the social credit system. And I think just to almost done, just one last thing, there are a few cities who target citizens. And so we actually looked at those. I mean, they're really not so important because these are really smaller cities. But those who actually have a citizens social credit system, and there it's mainly like very basic things. They, for example, look, have you donated money? Have you had a traffic accident? And if you do some of these things, you get on certain lists. But actually China used to have these lists anyway, yeah, shaming and naming, it's called. But if you actually look at these pilots, the participation rate is very low because most of them are voluntary. So in all the cities we looked at, they have a participation rate between 10%, and the highest we found was 39% in Hangzhou, but that's also where Alibaba is based. And the one city that is mandatory, the people we interviewed, they basically said it's very, it's allocated. I'm a government official and the local bureau makes me register for the social credit score. And I need a score for job promotion and job transfer. So it's really just an allocated task, like a duty, because you're an official, you need this. And another person also said it's very time consuming. You have to do activities to boost your score. And this is all in this one city where it's mandatory. So it's boring and useless. So it's not so developed as it sometimes seems. So last slide on citizens' attitude. So I did a lot of surveys in China asking people, do you like facial recognition? Do you like social credit? Do you like contact tracing app? And in all of these surveys, which were like with thousands of people each time, the answer was, yes, I accept it, it's okay. And it's useful, convenient. And in each of the survey, there's only a small group, which I call the digital doubters. So these are people who are a bit more skeptical. I did the same survey on facial recognition in Germany and in the US. Guess who's the most critical one? The Germans, yeah, the Germans love privacy. And so, but I find this very fascinating, right? And so first I was like, maybe it's my method, right? Survey methods in an authoritarian state might be really problematic. So we did lots of interviews in Germany and in China on facial recognition. And actually you ask people and they find this okay. And then I was like, okay, let's look at the digital doubters group. So the 20%, let's look at them and try to see in China why they maybe are more skeptical. And the ones who are more skeptical, I was a bit surprised. Some actually have privacy concerns, and but actually mostly they were not convinced of the benefits of the technology. Right? People always think it's the risks, but actually, I'm just talking about the attitudes. Most of them were like, oh, it's not convenient, not efficient, nothing in it for me. But then we did a study, actually, and we looked at like an experiment. We're like, maybe it's the propaganda in China, right? I mean, the newspapers are state-owned, and the propaganda machine, when they talk about facial recognition, just say it's such a great tool to fight crimes. So we're like, okay, let's do an experiment, and we give more information to certain groups in the experiment if they know more about the potential risks. Maybe they are more skeptical. And yes, surprise, there is this element that if you know more about the risks, you maybe, or the abuses, you might change a bit your attitude. But the effect was also not so huge. So it's a mix, yeah? So a little bit is because it's not a very open discussion on this in China. I also, by the way, don't think it's a great discussion in Europe. I think all societies somehow lack a real discussion about what this means. But in China, of course, the technologies are very much portrayed in the eye of the party. Just to give you one last example, we studied all the newspapers and did some sentiment analysis. So we took all the newspapers, and the computer told us is it positive or negative, and we took the social credit. So any article on social credit in China, and the computer spit out 96% are positive. Only 4% were negative about the social credit system. And the 4% that was negative, any ideas? It was the local government overusing it. And then the central government criticized the local government. So the central government is a good person criticizing the local government. So of course, so I think this is something to, and when you put this in context, why so many people are accepting, it's a complicated mix. There's some resignation also, actually, and there is actually the commercial players like Alibaba. For a long time, until recently, there was no data protection laws. They could do whatever they wanted. And Beijing did this on purpose to build up their technology state. They needed these companies, yeah. So they let them go wild until they get too big and powerful, and then there was a crackdown. And Jack Ma had to disappear, if you followed the news. He recently reappeared because China realized just cracking down on the tech sector is also not possible. So they need them. So they're trying to find a new relationship, these two. Okay, but so this is citizens' attitudes, little resignation. There's also little perceived individual agency. But there's also this group, they're the strong technology believers. And I honestly find this fascinating. When I did the interviews on facial recognitions in Germany, all the Germans have so many reasons why it's so bad, and like they can't see any good in technology. They're like technology haters sometimes, but some of the technology is used for good things. And in China, it's the other extreme a little bit. You know, it's like first what people think about, all the good things that these technologies can do. Last, I want to just leave on society, because there are now increasingly discussions on privacy. There are new privacy laws in China. The party actually introduced them. And so now we see sometimes sporadic protests online. And there was a very famous professor actually who couldn't enter the zoo because he was not willing to do facial recognition. He filed a lawsuit against the zoo and won that. So there's slowly some agency where citizens also fight against this. Another example is the health code, right? This was very intrusive. And some local cities were like, this is great. We will do, once the pandemic is over, we change the health code into a civility code. And actually citizens were like, no, thank you. And there were a lot of protests online, and the local government had to stop this pilot project and say, no, we are not doing this civility code. So this also shows you can't do whatever you want. It's like a very sensitive line. But what is noticeable, the absence of non-governmental organizations in the digital rights fields. I mean, we have AI now in Europe and so on, but I don't think they're very large, or I don't know actually, but I don't think there are really active NGOs. NGOs are in environmental field very active, but in the digital rights fields in China, I still think that's a growing field. Okay, I think on that note, to conclude, and we can then have a discussion. Thanks for staying with me for so long. So digital technologies improve in some ways, some injustice, and some offer some equality. I mean, it is a tool for citizens empowerment. Information is more easily accessible. It also puts local governments under pressure to be transparent. We had these apps about air pollution, but it's of course very much guided transparency. There are still many areas where there's no transparency. But it's also a room for exchanging opinions. And also, if you look actually at collective action in China, it is very much organized also on social media. But it leads to social exclusion. We talked about the old people who go to workshops for X, but this is really elderlies in a like increasingly growing gray society are excluded. There's this danger of function creep. We remember the protesters who were suddenly not allowed to leave the house. So in the end, there is a need for debate, how much digitalization is good, in which areas. And this is especially, of course, important in China, when in a very authoritarian state, where there are problems of digital overreach and negative effects. So I think on this note, I'm really finished, and I look forward to any questions and discussion.